Hello everyone. So continuing on our SRV-V6 series. In the introduction video, we kind of quickly talked about what is SRV-V6. And one of the things that we kind of touched pretty quickly or read in the documentation was the SRV-V6 header, or in short, that was called SRH. So in this episode, we will go ahead and spend some time to understand the SRV-V6 header. It's pretty important that you kind of, knows about the SRH or the SRV-V6 header and what are the different things, and how the IPv6 kind of, really made all that possible where now we can use IPv6 as the data plane for the segment routing. And that's why it becomes very critical for us to really understand the working or the details about the SRV6 header or the SRH. So there is, I'm looking at one of the Cisco Live PPT. I would be referencing to that again. All the credit goes to the creator. And again, this is the RFC for the SRH. It is your RFC 8785. It really talks about the segment routing header, and we would go ahead and do a deep dive into what are the things or we would get to see in an SRV-V6 header, or the what we call simply as the SRH. So that's what we're going to go ahead and take a look at your SRH, which is nothing but segment routing header. And if I have to just quickly talk about the segment routing can be applied to the IPv6 data plane. That's what we learned in the previous episode, using a new type of a routing extension header. So it is simply an extension to the existing header. Okay. And this extension is simply called as your segment routing header, or SRH, and that's what we'll be going to go ahead and spend some time and take a look at what are the different things it has to offer. But before we go ahead and quickly talk about the SRH, I want to recap on a couple things that we touched base in the previous episode, that in an SRV-V6, which is simply your segment routing over IPv6, an IPv6 address represents an instruction. Keep that in mind, guys. Again, SRV-V6 uses a new type of IPv6 routing extension header. So that means it is an extension to the existing IPv6 header. And this new extension of the header is simply called your segment routing header, or SRH in short form. And what is the use of this SRH? In order to encode an ordered list of instructions. So now we would be using this SRH to encode the list of instruction. And again, an instruction is simply an IPv6 address, okay, in the case of SRV-V6. And that's what we're going to go ahead and take a look at. So now I'm switching back to the Cisco Live presentation, and we'll quickly go over and, in a little bit more details on this SRV-V6 header. So now if you take a look at, this is the typical, your SR IP V6 header. So within this header, there are quite a lot of information that you get to see here. There is a version, there is a traffic class, flow label, payload length, next header, hop limit. You have a source address, and then you have something called like your destination header. So we are looking at simply an IPv6 header. So here the next header field. So if you take a look at this next header field, this next header field kind of really indicate what comes next. And if you remember, this next header field is kind of similar to like a protocol field in the IPv4 header. If you're familiar with the IPv4 header, we had a protocol field, and that's what then the IPv6, this next header field is kind of really trying to tell us, what are things. And this next header field could have different values. So now, like as this slide kind of shows, okay, hey, now the next header has a value of 17. So here the 17 really indicates that, okay, hey, now this is of type UDP. And let me just go back, and if you remember, we have only few things here. And now as soon as the type change, and now the type is 17, we do get to see a little bit more details. Now we have a length, we have a checksum, we have a data. Similarly, this field could have some other value. So now it could have a value of 4. 4 really indicates it's an IPv4. Now, if it's an IPv4, you could see the header change appropriately. Now we have like, protocol, we have a source address, destination address, type of service, a padding, and few other things. So you could see that this source header, this next header is kind of really giving us a lot of information. Similarly, it could have value of 6 that really indicate TCP. Now, if you remember, we had the window size, the acknowledgement number, sequence number, padding, all that information because of it. This is now your TCP, the type contains TCP. Similarly, this header could have different values. So in this slide, it shows that the next header field is a 43. So 43 is really telling a type that it is of a type routing. Okay. So now when you have 43, we have a couple more information. We have a next header, header extension length, routing type, and segments left. So here the next header could have different values, like again IPv4, TCP, UDP, header extension length. So now this an IPv6 device can skip this header. If it is an IPv6 device, it can just simply skip this particular one. And the segment left, again, ignore extension header if equal to 0. And I'm going to go ahead and touch base on some of these things. So what here the 43 indicates, it is again a IPv6 routing extension header. That's what we kind of left, read it quickly. And the segment left here really indicates whether or not now we have reached to the end of the source routed path or not. If we have reached to the end of our source routed path, the value will be set to 0. That means we have kind of reached to the end. Now no more processing needs to be done. Simply ignore the routing header. That's what this field kind of really talks about, segments left. And these are the different things that we can do. Now there is one important thing I want to highlight before I kind of switch it to the next slide and talk about it. Let me go back and switch it to the RFC here, and I'm going to scroll in this RFC. And I apologize, I know I have zoomed it pretty large. I'm just trying to scroll in this RFC to show you one of the thing this RFC kind of talks about. Okay, segment routing header. So routing headers are defined in this RFC. SRH has a new routing type. So SRH has a new routing type, and the type is defined as 4. So now there is a new type, and the type for that is kind of 4. And the type 4 really indicates here that this is now a segment routing. So when you have the type 4, that really indicates, okay, hey, it is a segment routing header now. And that's what this RFC kind of brings, or shows quite a lot of good detail here. Now let me switch it to the next slide here. So now if you take a look at in this particular slide, this is our header as we have been going through. Now the 43, again 43 indicates a routing, and here 4 really indicates it is of a type of the segment routing. Now this is something we learned early on today also, that each segment is an IPv6 address. Keep that in mind, guys. Okay. And now another thing that you need to take a look at here, this is 43 source address, destination address. And then you have these different segments. You have first segment, you have active segment, you have your last segment. And now if you take a look at here, this last segment really points to this last segment. And if you take a look at the value of the last segment is 0 here. Okay. Now then you have this active segment that really indicates number of kind of segments left. That value goes into your active segment, which happens to be your destination address, or that will go here into your active destination. And then you have your first segment, which is your kind of starting in the first segment, that goes under this particular first segment. So these segments are simply 128-bit IPv6 addresses. Keep that in mind again. And again, this slide kind of really talks about, but it is pretty important that I'll also go ahead and mention that these segments, the segment that we see, these are encoded in the reverse order of the path. That means the last segment is 0. The first segment is at the index indicated by the or SR header actually. Okay. And the active segment index is the segment's left value, whatever the segments are kind of left here. So that's what it says. The last segment index is 0. That's what we kind of read through. The first segment index is your first segment, and the active segment index is your number of segments left. Okay. And the active segment is copied in the destination address field of the IP header. And additional data can be stored into the different TLVs. So that's what you need to keep in mind, that this is how your SRH header kind of looks like, where the type is 43, which is routing, and 4 really indicate that it is of a segment routing type. And each segment is an IP address. That's what we talked about, and each of them is like 128 bits, because it's an IPv6 address. And the segments are encoded in the reverse order. That means the last segment, which is on the top of this list, is going to have a index value of 0, And at the bottom is your first index, and the active segment which is currently being processed is always being copied to the destination address, and that's how the system kind of is going to process this through. So I want you to go ahead and read more about it again, refer to the Cisco Live doc or go over the RFC, or, go back to our friendly blog that we have been referencing, segment-routing.net. Again, thanks to those guys putting such a wonderful material out there, or refer the official Cisco documentation to go over it. But yeah, make sure you are familiar with this whole SRH. What is the, the stack, or how the segments are kind of, arranged. They are arranged in the reverse order or encoded, and the top one is the zero, the bottom one is the first, and your active segments always gets copied to the destination address, and the segments left really indicates, okay, how many more segments are left before we reach to our last segment or final destination. So if you think of these, if I have to just quickly give you a glimpse here, first segment probably would indicate, like your source node or first node where to start, and last would be probably your destination. And any active segment, probably are the different node that you're trying to traverse to reach to your final destination. And again, this would be a topic of our next discussion. But before that, I want to make sure you are familiar with SRH. Do spend some quality time going over, some of these things. And again, I'm referencing all of this material which is publicly available. So feel free to go ahead and read more about it and you enhance your knowledge before we jump into the next section. Thank you. I will see you guys in next episode.